Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I'm cautiously optimistic about Final Fantasy XVI as a game, but really excited that we finally have another mainline Final Fantasy, no matter what it looks like. So, as a kind of warm-up for 16, for the past few years I have committed to playing all the previous mainline entries in the franchise, finally closing some glaring gaps in my history with the series. There are obviously a lot of Final Fantasy rankings on YouTube, so to set my video apart from the others, I have decided to make not only a ranking of the series, but a retrospective ranking at that. So I'll talk about the games chronologically, mentioning some background info, and at the same time I'll be ranking them. I have decided on this format because it gives the older entries a time to shine. After all, putting a bunch of 30-year-old titles near the bottom automatically simply because they aren't up to snuff anymore can be unfair, and disheartening for those who have grown up with the franchise and might be willing to overlook some systems and design choices that clash with modern tastes and sensibilities. To make a comparison to another art form, should we compare the Murujuga art gallery to Starry Night or to this JPEG of a monkey? It's simply unfair. This way I can still compare the games, but keeping the entries within the context of their time when evaluating them and giving each one their moment in the spotlight. What else? Well, no major spoilers, only plot summaries throughout. I'm also going to talk about the games following their original Japanese numbers, so no FF6 is 3 nonsense. Finally, I'm also avoiding the mainline MMOs and direct sequels, so no 11, 14, 10.2, 12.2, 13.2, etc. Maybe I'll tackle those in the future, we'll see. And that's enough preamble, the video is already long as it is. Just remember to subscribe if you haven't, to share your takes on the comments, and also to make any suggestion on how to improve my content. Here we go. It is the late 1980s and Japan is on the top of the world, culturally and economically. There are bonkers tokusatsu and killer anime on TV, and kick-ass songs that could rival any mainstream Western hit. And it's not only city pop, I might add. The economy is booming so much that according to historians, the Yakuza would beat the shit out of each other and yen bills would fly out in the middle of the street. Amidst this, the Japanese video game industry is an uncontested juggernaut, with many console manufacturers and gaming publishers being undisputed leaders in the market. However, that was not the case for everyone. In a then simply named Square, its director of planning and development, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was tasked with making a game that could change the downward spiral the company was stuck in. At the time, Square was faced with the very real possibility of going bankrupt after a string of misses like the Death Trap, King's Knight, and an alien side-scrolling game. Sakaguchi had always wanted to make an RPG but never got permission from the higher-ups, as they expected such an endeavor would fail. However, after the success of Dragon Quest in Japan and with their backs against the wall, Square finally let Sakaguchi have his way, and development on the original Final Fantasy began with a team of 7 people. Yeah, those were different times. Final Fantasy tells the story of the 4 warriors of light destined by prophecy to save the land from a growing evil. To do so, they have to retrieve 4 orbs and defeat 4 demons responsible for this plague that is ravaging the land. Yeah, it sounds pretty cliché for 2023, but it just works. Tropes exist for a reason, after all, and hey, the story has a solid twist if you are unfamiliar with the narrative. It still holds up, even though it is much more straightforward than many later entries. And thinking about it, that's actually a pro compared to some of the nonsense we'll endure later on. Kenji Terada wrote the scenario based on a story by Sakaguchi, and Koichi Ishii, best known for later creating the Mana series, influenced the setting with the heavy focus on the importance of orbs and crystals. The simple yet effective tale comes together due to the game's fairly complex systems, especially considering this was an NES game. You could even name the 4 characters in your team with, get this, no more than 4 letters per name. You could also choose from 6 different classes, including series staples like White Mage, Black Mage, and Red Mage, as well as prototypes for Warrior, Monk, and Thief. So you get 6 classes but only 4 characters. This means you get to choose how you are going to configure your team, bringing a lot of flexibility to the turn-based battle system, which was developed by Akitoshi Kawazu and was fairly revolutionary for the time, as most RPGs back then had battles in first person, while FF used the third person, which also allowed players to face off against larger groups of enemies at a time. Kawazu also included weaknesses to elements like fire, ice, thunder, etc., something that was novel in Japan at the time. However, without a mana or magic point system, using magic was far harder, as charges, the sort of currency used to deal magic damage, could only be restored by sleeping in inns. Yep, no ethers were available. Inns also didn't cure status effects like poison, which is incredibly frustrating, especially when you have no control over the enemy encounters. But hey, it's a 35-year-old game running on a console with the processing power of a toaster. It is a miracle this simply exists. Rounding up the most notable names involved in the first game, we gotta mention Yoshitaka Mano, who was hired as a character designer and would be involved in every mainline game in the series in some capacity, while Nobuo Uematsu was responsible for composing the music for the game's score. And seriously, what a score that was, including from the get-go absolute classics that would resonate throughout the history of the series, like the fanfare when you win a battle, the menu screen tune, and also the Final Fantasy main theme, which, a lot has been said about the game's title. There has been this anecdote going around for years now that Sakaguchi decided to name the game Final Fantasy as Square was facing bankruptcy, and that was his last shot at gaming development before packing his things and going back to university. And although that's a great story, Sakaguchi himself has said that the intention was to have the game's name be abbreviated to FF, and that the original name was actually Fighting Fantasy, but legal problems with that name led them to change it to another word starting with F, hence final. However, any other word with F would have been fine. The game would finally be released on December 18th, 1987, and the rest is history. And obviously, at the time of its release, Final Fantasy was the best Final Fantasy out there. The first Final Fantasy sold like hotcakes, and Square immediately greenlighted a sequel. However, the original game didn't really warrant one. Not that this would stop later installments from getting insane follow-ups, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyway, the finality of the original's game story led Square to just make Final Fantasy an anthology series, with each entry getting its own setting and unique characters, only reusing some iconic elements from the previous games, like traveling across the overworld on an airship, the classes, crystals, elements of the score, etc., which was pretty bold and unheard of at the time when it came to gaming. Less than a year after the release of FF1, Final Fantasy II would drop on December 17th, 1988, with most of the original development team returning for the sequel. A lot of plot elements sound instantly familiar as well. You have four main characters which are all orphans this time around, as their parents are all killed by the Emperor and the evil Empire of Palamisha in the beginning of the game. The story overall is a much more complex affair with a lot of sacrifices and deaths. It's a much more dramatic affair with an intensity that wasn't really there in the original. The involvement of the player with the plot is also more hands-on, as there is a question and answer progression system named word memory at play. You would have to memorize something said by a character previously so you could use it in a later event in the story multiple times. It is simply more interactive, although this can get frustrating if you're not paying attention. Regarding the gameplay, the most noteworthy thing about 2 is its leveling system, or rephrasing here, the lack of one. That doesn't mean characters don't evolve though, because character attributes would increase the more they were used, which opened up opportunities to game the system and pretty much break the game by attacking each other or reissuing commands, since cancelling a command would not cancel the improvement in the skill. It seems like a glaringly obvious fault in design, but do I need to remind you this was made in less than a year 34 years ago? Speaking of the making of Final Fantasy II, the game's programmer, yes programmer, not head programmer or lead programmer or anything, a single dude coded the entire game. Iranian-American Nasir Jabali had to return to California because his work visa expired in Japan, forcing the entire production of the game to move to the US with him, which is insane. Japan really doesn't play when it comes to making the life of foreigners hard over there, Jesus. To wrap this up, Final Fantasy II also brings a lot of elements that are series mainstays, like Cid, Chocobos, temporary party members, the Dragoon class, and more complex main characters who, this time, don't have customizable classes, as the jobs that Firion, Maria, Leon, and Guy possess are part of each character's personality. Even though it brings so many advancements and presents a more involved tale than the original, I think I still prefer 01 over 2. The leveling system is pretty weird in the story, although more ambitious than the one in the first game, pales in comparison to some of the following entries. One, on the other hand, has this innocent charm to it, and I feel like if I had to replay one of these games again, it would be Final Fantasy I. The major players from the development of 1 and 2 would all be back for the third entry in the series, which was released on April 27, 1990, 16 months after the release of FF2, which gave the team some room to breathe after the crazy short development time of the second game. The plot, once again, focuses on 4 orphans having to restore the balance between light and darkness, and just like in FF1, these 4 are blank slates without major personality traits, which, yeah, is a step back from 2. The story, however, is longer than the ones before, featuring ancient, highly technological civilizations, floating continents, and a great final boss. The game features a job system with plenty of classes for you to choose from, including new ones like Summoner, meaning that for the first time you can conjure classic franchise summons like Shiva and Ifrit mid-battle. Everyone starts out as an Onion Knight, with new classes popping up as the story progresses. We also get a return of the experience system from 1, which, thank God. Job-specific commands are introduced as well, like the Dragoon's ability to jump. 3 also is the first entry in the series to feature Moogles, another Final Fantasy staple engineered to sell plush toys. Oh, so cute. Do you know what else returned from the previous entries? Nasir Jabali's work visa forcing the development team of the game to move to California. How? Japan doesn't play around, man. With 3, we finally have all the main elements that make a Final Fantasy game a Final Fantasy game. Everything is finally there. I overall feel that the NES version of the story feels like a step down from 2 due to the generic characters. Fortunately, this is remedied in the DS remake of the game, which presents a more fleshed out Act 1, giving each orphan a name and a personality. I don't think you can find that version easily, without... But if you can find it, play that one, it's great. If I take the DS remake into account, 3 is by far the best game out of the NES trilogy. If we ignore it, like the recent Pixel remaster did, it is still the best out of the 3 because of its gameplay, but the lead it has over FF1 becomes smaller. Overall, I feel like the NES games are only recommended if you really want to see how it all started. Playing the series chronologically feels like trying to get into David Bowie because you saw those crazy Ziggy Stardust pictures of him, and then you find out that he actually began as a folk singer and that his first couple of albums are just, not what you were looking for. What I mean is, these are not good entry points at all, as they might put you off from enjoying the rest of the series, as they are really hard and punishing, although the quality of live features in the Pixel collection might have helped with that. I wouldn't know, I haven't bought the latest remastered collection yet. I only remember that traumatic one from a few years back that tried to fix the look of the characters and got a result similar to that lady who tried to fix the Jesus fresco. Anyway, let's continue. 6 months after the release of FF3 in November 1990, the world saw the release of Nintendo's 16-bit console, the Super Nintendo, or Super Famicom, or SNES, or SNES if you're kinky. With it, more bits, more processing power, and more in-cartridge storage were at the hand of developers, going from the 512 kilobytes present in NES cartridges to 4 megabytes in the SNES. At Square, bringing the Final Fantasy series to the new console felt like a no-brainer, and some of the major players from the NES trilogy would return for the 4th installment, like Sakaguchi, Uematsu, and Amano. Along with them, Takashi Tokita, who had worked in smaller roles in the previous games, would be promoted to lead designer of FF4, before moving on from the series to work on Chrono Trigger, Parasite Eve, Live Alive, and a bunch of other cool stuff. If you are looking for gripping stories and epic character arcs, this is where Final Fantasy truly begins. Released on July 19, 1991, Final Fantasy IV tells the story of Cecil, a dark knight who wants to prevent the sorcerer Golbez from destroying the world by means of, you guessed it, crystals. The orphans, on the other hand, are gone, as Cecil is by far the most fleshed out protagonist the series had seen by that point. He is a disgraced knight who is stripped of his rank due to questioning his king's decisions, and in his journey will be joined by a revolving door of party members, with highlights including Kain, Rosa, Tala, and one of the best Cids in the franchise. Most of the time, the story will dictate which characters you will get to play as, with the exception of a fifth party member for the only time in the series' history. Due to this more character-driven story, the job flexibility seen in 3 was scrapped, akin to what we saw in Final Fantasy II instead, with fixed jobs for each character depending on their role in the story. Combat, however, would continue to evolve as players would be introduced to the Active Time Battle System, or ATB from now on. This system, designed by Hiroyuki Ito, forced players to be quicker as enemies didn't have to wait for you to attack. When their ATB bar filled up, they would get an immediate turn, and so would you for that matter. To me, this right here is classic Final Fantasy. Do notice that in the original version of the game, there was no visible bar to tell you who would act next, something which would only be introduced in Final Fantasy V. Furthermore, the story in 4 is really solid. You truly care for the characters, and when they die, or not, you feel something. 4 is also the first game in the series to add a romance subplot, something which would only grow more prominent in later entries. It's just a great console RPG all around, and according to Takashi Tokita in an interview when promoting the DS remake of 4, the game was meant to condense everything that worked on the NES trilogy. The jobs from Final Fantasy III, the focus on story from the second game, and the 4 elemental bosses acting as symbols of the game as in the first installment. And yeah, that's spot on. 4 truly feels like a culmination of the series up until that moment in time, especially if you go for the DS remake, which was my introduction to the game, by the way. But again, unless you go swashbuckling, I guess it's much easier to go with the 2D version seeing the pixel remaster. Either way, FF4 is the best one so far and the first truly great intro point for beginners interested in getting into Final Fantasy. Top-notch stuff. Production for FF5 would begin immediately after 4's release, and the trio of Sakaguchi, Amano, and Uematsu returned for another round of fantasy making. A new name, however, has to be mentioned, as he would only grow in prominence with every subsequent release. Tetsuya Nomura, who after debugging Final Fantasy IV, was responsible for the monster designs for 5. Regarding the story and world building in 5, the game sees a return of the 4 elemental crystals, who show up in 2 sets this time, tied to the fates of 2 parallel worlds. After the sprawling cast seen in 4, Final Fantasy V features only 5 playable characters, although only 4 are playable at once. This lets everyone have their moment in the spotlight, with Faris being by far the most compelling character in the cast, although the amnesiac Galuf puts up a good fight and stars in one of the franchise's most memorable scenes. Bartz, the protagonist, has a charming personality but isn't really as interesting as Cecil before him. We also see a return of the job system from 3, with over 20 jobs for each character to master, including new ones such as Blue Mage and Time Mage. 5 also introduces ability points, meaning that you can level up your stats by gaining XP and can evolve within a job with AP. Combat retains the ATB system from 4, but the ATB bar indicating whose turn is up was first introduced here, finally establishing the system we'll get used to in the next few installments in the series. Overall, Final Fantasy V is a great, tight story with solid pacing and some emotional moments that make the journey worth it. It is also the first Final Fantasy to feature multiple endings, depending on who is still standing after the final battle. 5 doesn't reach the same heights as 4, but still is a worthy entry in the series and shows that Final Fantasy was a well-oiled machine with no signs of slowing down. In fact, 16 months later, we would get the next and final installment in the SNES trilogy, Final Fantasy VI. The swan song of the SNES era, Final Fantasy VI was released on April 2nd, 1994, being the first game not directed by Hironobu Sakaguchi, who remained in a producing role. The role of director would be split between two future legendary Square figures, Yoshinori Kitase and Hiroyuki Ito, the latter the creator of the ATB system. However, Yoshitaka Mano would continue to be the series' character designer, while Nobuo Uematsu was responsible for the game's score. Despite being the last SNES-era Final Fantasy VI would actually bring a whole lot of innovation to the series, moving from the medieval fantasy template from the first 5 entries to a more steampunk one, which would bleed onto the following mainline games. After the tight cast of 5, 6 would also present the biggest cast the series had ever seen up to that point, with 14 playable characters. And just like seeing in 4, there would be no job system, as a character's class is integral to their personality and arc. However, unlike 4, 6 presents you with multiple moments in which you customize 3 sets of characters and play as them alternatively, helping the other groups out in order to move through a dungeon, escape enemies, etc. This way, you are forced to use all the characters, and you end up getting to know them all, although some are obviously more essential to the plot than others. Terra, Celes, Locke, Edgar, Sabin, Shadow, there are so many memorable characters in 6, and all of them get a chance to shine. It truly is an ensemble cast, which makes it harder to pinpoint who is the protagonist, and if you didn't know, that was by design. The idea behind 6 was that everyone is the protagonist, with all members of the design team contributing characters and their background story and episodes to the game. Terra and Locke were developed by Sakaguchi, while Celes was created by Kitase, Shadow by Nomura, and so on and so forth. But hey, the very first character you control in the game is Terra, and she got a spot on Final Fantasy All-Stars, aka Dissidia, representing FF6, so we might as well call her the first female protagonist in the series. Regarding the game's systems, yet another great addition by Ito was the Magic Point system, similar to the AP one seen in FF5. When a summon was attributed to a character, that character would begin to learn magic abilities associated with summon, or Asper, as they were called in 6. This game system is neatly integrated into the story, as the ability to learn from summons make them of interest not only to you, but to the evil forces we oppose in 6, including Kefka, the best antagonist in any Final Fantasy game ever, with an iconic laugh to boot. 6 has so many memorable characters and moments. I didn't even mention the opera or the events at the floating continent. It really is that good. It is easily the culmination of the series up to that moment, and a must-play for anyone interested in 2D gaming. Go play it. With a new generation of gaming on the horizon, Square had to decide where to take the franchise next. The logical choice would be the Nintendo 64, continuing the almost decade-long relationship the series had developed with Nintendo up until that point. However, the limitations of the cartridges Nintendo would continue to use were no match to the appeal of CD-ROMs, the cutting-edge technology associated with Sony's PlayStation. The possibilities of full-motion videos being stored in multiple discs won Square over, and a mainline Final Fantasy would not debut in Nintendo hardware ever again. Development for the 7th mainline title in the series kept many of the previous entries' main personnel, with series creator Sakaguchi returning as a producer, Kitase as a director, and Uematsu as a composer. However, the role of main character designer would shift from Amano to Nomura, as Amano's commitment to international exhibitions of his work inhibited his involvement. Amano would work only on the game's logo and some promotional material, a role he would keep going forward. Regarding the game's story, it is incredibly hard to find anyone who hasn't been exposed to Final Fantasy VII at this point, or at least to the remake of its first act. All you have to know is that 7 doubles down on the steampunk foundation established by 6, adding sci-fi elements to the mix and an even more futuristic look. In it, we follow Cloud, a mercenary who joins a Nico-terrorist group facing off against a mega-corporation named Shinra. From there, things will take some wild turns, and as always, the fate of the whole world will be in your hands, with memorable characters like Barret, Tifa, Aerith, Red 13, and Vincent joining the party throughout your journey. Being the first of the 3D Final Fantasies, FF7 would lay the groundwork for the PlayStation trilogy, introducing clever solutions for dealing with the hardware limitations, like the use of not-so-good 3D character models over gorgeous 2D pre-rendered artwork. This clever solution would put Final Fantasy's presentation way above the pure 3D seen in other titles in the system. That, mixed with jaw-dropping cutscenes, would make Final Fantasy VII a must-play for gamers in the late 90s, and the game, when it dropped in early 1997, was an instant hit. I know that for many, Final Fantasy VII is the apex of the franchise, as it was probably their first in the series and overall formative experience, but to me it is still fairly below 6. Sephiroth is a great villain, but Kefka is better. The ensemble in 7 is well developed and charismatic, but the one in 6 manages to be even more, even with bigger limitations in presentation. Another thing that probably brings 7 down to me personally is the fact that I got a PlayStation late into its life cycle, so when I finally got one, Final Fantasy VII wasn't the new kid on the block, it was 8. Released in early 1999, 8 would see the return of Kitase, Nomura, and Uematsu as director, main character designer, and composer, respectively. Sakaguchi, however, would be even less involved with 8 than he was with 7. 8 would lean harder on sci-fi elements than 7, also ditching the super deformed look for its characters for the first time ever. In it, we follow a group of teenagers trying to make it as mercenaries in a military school. As the story progresses, we'll join yet another resistance group fighting against a totalitarian regime. There are evil sorceresses, time traveling, aural projection, and a lot of other wacky concepts across 4 discs. It is a wild, uneven ride, with a plot twist involving summons which occurs in disc 2 at an orphanage that's just bad. Like, really bad. It's probably one of the worst twists in the history of gaming. It's just so unnecessary and simply never brought up again in the story that it's just baffling that this wasn't scrapped in a rewrite. But then again, this thing was made in a little over 2 years, probably there wasn't one. Hiroyuki Ito finally slips up when it comes to a battle system, as the junctioning system seen in 8 is sort of a chore. You have to junction the summons or guardian forces as they are called in-game to the characters, so that you can have access to any command other than attack, which would be fine if the game didn't forcefully switch between groups of characters constantly. So you will end up forgetting to junction your characters in one of these witches, and you will get your ass handed to you by the stupidest monster, that's guaranteed. And there is also the draw system for magic, which can be extremely boring if you actually intend to cast magic as a battle strategy. Or it can almost break the game if you stock magic up to junction it to different attributes. XP is also bizarre, as leveling up can actually hinder your progress in the game, as bosses and monsters will level up according to your own level. It's weird. I admire the attempt at something different, but it doesn't work that well. At least the ATB bones from the previous entries are still there. But still, I love this game. It was my very first Final Fantasy, and because of that, it holds a special place in my heart. 8 has the best video game opening ever. That cutscene paired with Liberi Fatali is just unmatched, and the game just oozes coolness. The mercenary high school setting was inventive for its time, gunblades are awesome, hot dogs get the admiration they deserve, Triple Triad is the best minigame in the whole series, Eyes on Me is a really great ballad that I listen to this day, I really like Squall as a protagonist, and don't mind the romance subplot. And overall, 8 has an even greater disc 1 than 7. The story has some pacing issues and sort of goes on for too long, a problem which would afflict some following entries as well. I also can't forgive how useless that whole Laguna subplot is, but then again, I like the character and his battle theme kicks ass, so I'll take the good with the bad, I guess. Overall, I know that 8 is a mixed bag, however, oh god. To me, it is better than 7. Please don't leave, I have even hotter takes later on this video, you will want to wait for those. But listen, put yourself in my place. Imagine you are a teen in 2000, and you play 8, love it, and decide to play 7 right after it. What do you immediately see? Can you really connect to these ugly character models? I didn't know it would eventually become a classic. I just played it for a while, thought the characters looked ugly as hell, got lost in Disc 2 and never returned to it before Remake was released. After finally getting my Platinum for 7, I now get the hype, but my nostalgia is attached to 8, not 7, so up to second place it goes. We'll see if it can keep this placement after this next entry. Starting development virtually at the same time as 8, Final Fantasy IX would end up being the swan song for some classic Final Fantasy personnel. Series creator Hironobu Sakaguchi returned to pen the story, Yoshitaka Mana returned for a final more involved participation, creating the original concepts and designs for the characters, while Nobuo Uematsu would return for a final exclusive Final Fantasy score. Finally, Hiroyuki Ito was back to helm the project after coming out with the ATB system and directing 6. All of these seasoned players returned with a mission to bring back classic fantasy to Final Fantasy. The chibi art style for the characters in the medieval setting of the original games make a return, as well as a focus on crystals, with one of them even featuring on the game's logo. Classic jobs are also back, and ATB is still going strong. The game feels like a tribute to classic Final Fantasy, and it truly works. Back when it was released, 9 was sort of the black sheep of the PlayStation trilogy, since it did away with a lot of what Western players had associated with the brand up until that point, having mainly played 7, 8, and maybe 6. However, 9 has been re-evaluated over time, and gamers now see it for what it is, a love letter to classic RPGs of the NES and SNES eras. Zidane, 9's protagonist, is an extrovert after the doom and gloom scene with Squall and Cloud, which is a welcome change. He is a member of a theater troupe who is tasked with kidnapping the princes of the Kingdom of Alexandria by an unknown party, because its queen, Braun, is starting a war that can affect the balance of every kingdom in the land. It's some classic stuff, really. Most characters bring something to the party, and Vivi, Steiner, Garnet, and Freya are among the best the series has ever seen. Final Fantasy IX is a classic and a must-play. It isn't perfect by any means. The camera zooming in and out before a battle starts takes forever and gets tiring as the game goes on. The card game is a major step down after the perfection of Triple Triad, and the requirements to get the Platinum are so ridiculous that I didn't even bother with it. And just like 8, it goes on for a little bit longer than it needed to, with a final boss battle that had no reason to exist. Overall, it is the best game in the PlayStation trilogy, which to me is by far the most consistent era the series has ever seen. Coincidentally, I found out about Final Fantasy in this era, so maybe I'm just biased. Still, I feel like 6 has the edge over 9, as I can't find anything negative to say about it, and like I said, 9 has its flaws. With the PS1 trilogy out of the way, it was time for another hardware update, and an entry which would bring the series closer to what it is today. With the worldwide success of the PS1 trilogy and the now heavy association the franchise had with Sony, it was no wonder that Final Fantasy would remain a PlayStation exclusive for the 6th generation of gaming. What else could Square have done? Nintendo's hardware couldn't handle the vision they had for the series, Sega's hardware division was slowly crumbling, and Microsoft was an uncertain newcomer in the scene, yet to release the original Xbox. So, to the PlayStation 2 it went. What did even more powerful hardware mean for Final Fantasy? It meant more of everything. More graphics, more cutscenes, more pop songs, more belts, whistles, and zippers, and of course, more laughter. A year after the release of FF9, Square would release Final Fantasy X. This was only possible because the team helming 10 is essentially the same behind 8, not 9. Yoshinori Kitase directed and produced 10, while Tetsuya Nomura worked not only with the character design, but also with the game's script, along with many other team members. Uematsu would also return, but this time splitting duties with 2 other composers. The game is the first in the series to ditch the overworld view. There's no world map in this one. Eras are essentially continuous, with the ending of one connecting to the beginning of the next. 10 also removes the 2D background seen in the PS1 trilogy, being the first truly 3D game in the series. Furthermore, 10 also ditches the ATB system seen in the previous 6 games for the conditional turn-based battle, or CTB for short. It is actually pretty cool and softens the blow of losing such an integral part of the series. The sphere grid is great, and the option to switch party members mid-battle is a truly inspired one. Some of the cutscenes are iconic and will forever be ingrained in my mind, as well as the world of Spira, which truly is unique. Can you think of many other tropical fantasies out there? If you can, please let me know in the comments, I would love to check them out. However, I think I'm in the minority when I say that I could take or leave 10. I really like Yuna, but Tidus is really irritating and most characters in the main cast just left me cold. I will say one thing. The setup for the story is one of the best in the series, as well as the villains. But still, I just can't get into 10 like many other fans. Maybe it has to do with my completionist tendencies, because trying to reach 100% completion will undoubtedly make you hate this game. Blitzball is bullshit. In fact, the arbitrary things you have to endure to get all of the ultimate weapons are bullshit. I might just be bitter because I couldn't do that lightning dodging thing back then and couldn't do it now on the PS4 when replaying 10. It is the only thing keeping me away from that platinum. I've done it all. The butterfly bullshit, the chocobo racing in 0 seconds bullshit, the Pokédex bullshit. I've done so many things in game that now I pretty much can't stand FF10. And I still don't have a platinum to show for it, because of that damn lightning dodging thing. Screw you, game. A little under a year after 10, the franchise would receive its first MMO entry, Final Fantasy XI, a game that somehow is still going 20 years later. I have never played 11 as playing online on a PS2 back in the day was not feasible for me. And again, I'm not one to play online in general. I had my Korean MMO phase back in the 2000s, and that was enough for a lifetime. I guess I'm fine being antisocial. For those who have played it, make sure to tell me in the comments if you recommend it and how it stacks up against 14. Moving on to another highlight in the series, it's time for Final Fantasy XII. After receiving a yearly release for 4 years straight between 1999 and 2002, the mainline series would remain dormant for another 4 years, as the extra time needed to develop these explosive, big-budget blockbusters on more powerful systems finally caught up with Square. And the fact that one of the game's original directors, Yasumi Matsuno, had to leave production midway through due to health concerns probably didn't help. Matsuno, most known for directing Final Fantasy Tactics, provided the original concept and plot for the story, and collaborated with Final Fantasy VI and IX's director Hiroyuki Ito up until his departure. Hiroshi Minagawa would step up and become the other game's director alongside Ito. Art and score would also be filled up with new names, making 12 the first game without Uematsu in its soundtrack or Sakaguchi in any capacity. This influx of new talent helming a mainline games make 12 feel truly unique among the other titles in the series. The world of Ivalice, previously seen in Tactics, is unlike any other in the franchise, with its Mediterranean and Arabic influences. The game's presentation is also really impressive. It simply does not look like a PS2 game. It is even really brown like every other PS3 title. 12 feels like it truly brought the series forward by bringing so many great elements to the mix. After the world in 10 felt like a series of hallways linked to one another, 12 brings what finally feels like an open world. It is still a series of maps linked to each other, but these are bigger and more lived in than the ones in 10, and are just the right size to be honest. 12 would also do away with random battle encounters and bring about the Gambit system, which, to me, should have been a series mainstay just like the ATB before it. In this system, you get to program the AI in your companions to a level I haven't really seen in any other game. You get to set the priority in the specific conditions for the characters to make a particular action, so the AI can be truly helpful. When used properly, the system can make battles really dynamic and fast-paced. It doesn't even feel turn-based, to be honest. However, if you don't really feel like using gambits, then the characters you aren't controlling directly are going to be really useless. It is a punishing system for those who don't care for micromanaging things, so I get why so many dismiss this entry. But, like I said, to me it's great. 12 also introduces MMORPG-style side quests, like a series of hunts for tough monsters, something which fits really nicely with the story. Speaking of the story, let me address something which is always used against 12. Oh, it's just Star Wars. No, it isn't. If anything, Final Fantasy II is just like Star Wars. Maybe, just maybe, Act 1 of 12 kind of looks like A New Hope if you push it, but that's it, it's not Star Wars. Really, 12's story is great. It is a military tale that makes sense with clearly defined parties and motivations. The cast is mostly consistent, everyone gets a neat character arc, even temporary party members like Larsa, well, everyone except Penelo, she truly is useless. And just stressing this again, the villain's motivations are clear without any last-minute stupid review just for the sake of a stupid review. To me, 12 is awesome. It is one of the best in the series. I love the story, the world, the gameplay, and like most of the characters. Its soundtrack isn't really that memorable and things can look a little muted at times, since the world and the story are much more grounded than a lot of the craziness and excess seen in some previous titles. But still, 12 is in my top 3, right below 6 and 9. The emergence of a new generation of gaming meant that it was time for Square to decide yet again where to take the franchise next. Its now storied relationship with Sony would continue. However, the series would go multi-platform after 6 Nintendo exclusives and 6 Sony ones. This meant its titles going forward would be released not only for the PS3, but also for the Xbox 360. As always, Nintendo was left out of the party because really, do you think the Wii could handle these graphics? Final Fantasy XIII would begin development in 2004, helmed by the director of Final Fantasy X-2, Motomo Toriyama. The scenario of the game, of an isolated, floating world dominated by religious persecution and unjust gods that determine the fate of characters without their consent, was developed by Kazushige Nojima, a seasoned in-house writer who had worked on previous games all the way back to VII. Speaking of VII, Kitase would return as a producer, and Nomura as a character designer for this new entry. Uematsu, however, would not return in any capacity. Masashi Hamauzu, who collaborated with him on the soundtrack for 10, would go solo for 13's great score. Released in late 2009 in Japan and early 2010 worldwide, the game was intended to be the first in a series of Final Fantasy games tied to the same concept, known as Fabula Nova Crystallis. This would include Final Fantasy Versus 13 and Final Fantasy Agito 13, games that you know now as Final Fantasy XV and Type 0 respectively, because this Fabula Nova Crystallis thing didn't really pan out at all. The idea was such a mess, and it took Square Enix so long to realize how misguided their original intent was that it derailed the first half of the 2010s for the franchise. It's something that just fascinates me. It has such pathos that sometimes I can't help but think what could have been had it actually played out how the devs intended. Would Square finally have gone bankrupt like it almost did back in 1987? Or would they figure everything out and these would have been classics? We'll never know. Let's stop wondering and move on to gameplay. 13's paradigm shift is actually not so different from 12 when you look at it. However, the gambits have been predetermined for you, so you simply don't have any say on what the characters other than the ones you control are doing. This has led people to say that 13 plays itself, which, To be fair, is actually true when it comes to low-level mobs of enemies. However, the system can still be fun and stimulating, especially if you go for the optional hunting side missions, because those truly force you to shift paradigms left and right to survive. XIII has also been heavily criticized because its concepts like Fal'Cie, l'Cie, and Seath are somehow convoluted and hard to follow. This criticism, however, I can't get behind. I don't see what's so hard about it. You have these godlike figures who arbitrarily pick humans to do their bidding. If these humans fail, they become monsters. If the humans succeed, they are immortalized in crystal form. That's it. The game just gives a unique name to each one of these groups. It's not that hard. XIII is also somehow a hallway simulator according to fans. Which, again, is true. But so was X. In fact, there are a lot of parallels between X and XIII. Both are hallway simulators with casts that have style over substance for the most part. Both have ridiculous sequels that actually hinder the impact of their respective original endings, but somehow one gets praised to hell and back while the other one is loathed by fans, and I sort of disagree with that. I think you know where I'm going with this, don't you? Oh, what can I say, I'm a simp for Lightning. I played and loved / hated to love 13.2, 13.3, and would have played 13.4 if Square were even more insane. Also, My Hands is the best theme song in the franchise. It is absolutely cheesy, overdramatic, and excessive, and it fits perfectly with that ending with the crystallized Australians. It's amazing, I love that ending. Yeah, I know, 13 is trash, but it is my trash. With all of that said, I'm putting 13 above 10. We good? We good. Let's move on to another train wreck, shall we? Less than a year after the release of XIII, the second MMORPG in the franchise was released, Final Fantasy XIV. And oh boy, this one is a redemption tale for the ages, isn't it? When XIV was originally released in 2010, it was so bad that it had to be pulled out from stores, its servers shut down so that the team could go back to the drawing board and fix every complaint aimed at the game, because no mainline entry had ever had such a low score before. And surprise surprise, Naoki Yoshida and his team were able to turn things around, and when the game was relaunched in 2013, it slowly but surely won fans over, and it is now considered one of the best MMORPGs out there, and one of the best Final Fantasies ever by those who play it. These claims really get me curious to try 14 out, but I'm afraid that this thing would be a huge time sink, and I would end up not playing anything else ever again. No thank you. It feels like very little happened in the previous gen, and we are already moving on, huh? Well, it is understandable if you look at it. A team was trying to turn 14 around while the other was trying to make the Fabula Nova Crystallis thing happen and failing. Amidst this mess, the sole 8th gen entry in the series would be released for both Sony and Microsoft platforms, and eventually PC and even Stadia. The PS3 and PS4 eras didn't get trilogies like the ones before them, but thinking a little about it, if we join both of them up, we end up with a trilogy of train wrecks in 13, the original 14, and 15, yeah. Final Fantasy XV. Oh my. I have so much I'd like to say about this game, but I feel like this ranking is not really the place for this, so we'll try and keep it simple. Like I said before, 15 started development as Final Fantasy Versus 13 in 2006, then being released in late 2016, meaning this thing was in development for a decade. And you know what? It really needed more time in the oven, because 15 offers the most bare-bones experience in the history of the franchise. Its original director was Nomura, who was also responsible for the character designs. However, after 6 years of walking around in circles and not much happening because Nomura also had Kingdom Hearts to worry about, someone over at Square finally put their foot down and replaced Nomura with Hajime Tabata, who turned the production around, cut its ties to the Fabula Nova bullshit, and turned it into Final Fantasy XV. However, a lot of rewrites were needed to make the story allegedly work as a standalone. Like, we would originally have this blonde woman as a love interest, and then she was replaced by this blonde woman instead. Even though Square decided to move forward from the fabula nonsense, it still hadn't learned its lesson, as Final Fantasy XV would have its very own media universe. So to try and make sense of the characters and setting, you have to watch a 2-hour-long CGI movie and a bunch of anime. And even after all that, the game's story still falls flat. It is incredibly frustrating. That movie, for instance, is absolutely essential for the player to understand the story, and some of the most exciting moments in the narrative are all in this movie probably no one saw. Why? The story is a mess, and Square showed that they understood nothing from the criticism XIII got. Oh, people don't like hallway simulators, let's give them an open world instead. Sure, open worlds are fun. However, the narrative must fit an open world, which is not the case here. There is a huge disconnect between the story and the game's systems. We play as Noctis, a prince from a kingdom which is under siege, and his entourage. His dad was murdered, his fiancé is on the run, which is all in that movie, by the way. The evil empire is after him. Doesn't make any sense for Noctis to go and pick 3 flowers for some old lady. Doesn't make any sense for him to go fishing and explore some backwoods for crafting materials. It doesn't. This game's story does not fit an open world. And the gameplay is real-time, but there's no complexity whatsoever. It really feels like a Smash X to win type of situation. Square tried to salvage this by adding a bunch of character DLC and also patching the story so that it made more sense, but still, 15 only works because of the soundtrack by Yoko Shimomura and its characters. And not the fiancé or the Dead King, just Noctis and his bros. It's ridiculous to admit this, but you truly connect with the core characters in this one despite it all. All in all, the bros can't save 15 from a very low placement right before the NES trilogy. And I'm only placing it there because I feel like I would be more willing to replay 15 than those games. However, what those 3 games set out to accomplish, they did. 15 fails in pretty much everything but its main cast, so there's a strong case to say it is the worst in the series. What do you think? So, that's my final ranking. How does it compare to yours? Tell me in the comments down below, because I just love talking about Final Fantasy with other fans. People always have the wildest takes. I guess for most my list is wild, but from my perspective it's actually pretty coherent overall and you guys are the crazy ones. And that's it. I guess I recommend every single game in my top 7 if you are into 2D gaming or don't mind turn-based combat, with Final Fantasies X, XIII, and XV being more uneven experiences that require some extra patience and willingness from the player. The bottom 3, which are all NES titles, are down there because they truly require a specific state of mind to be enjoyed. They are not for everyone. If anything, making this long-winded video made me know who Hiroyuki Ito is and admire his work. My top 3 were all directed by him. I guess I'm a fan. We all know the big Final Fantasy names like Sakaguchi, Amano, Uematsu, and Nomura, but I had never heard of Ito before. The guy seriously deserves more recognition for his work on the franchise. And yeah, looking at the ups and downs of the franchise, I'm even more excited for 16. Too bad I'm yet to buy a PS5, so I guess I can't really play it day one. I think I'll go and replay 15 again in a masochist fit. Who knows, maybe it will finally click with me and I'll move it up a little, or drop it even more. And that's it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you when I see you.